And recording is up.
Great. Hello all, and welcome to our webinar on how to prevent invasive species in the right-of-way. We're going to go through a bunch of techniques, the narrative of why we do this work, and also some real picture-based ideas of how you can do this with control recommendations, some timing recommendations. So it's a whole smorgasbord of interesting things. So thanks for coming along. This will be recorded and available for later sharing and perusal. If we go too fast, you can go ahead and let us know your questions later too. You can also let us know your questions, as I mentioned earlier, in the chat box down below. We're going to keep everyone muted for our recording purposes, but you can chat questions as they come out for the sake of our edification, so we learn the best we can. My name is Matt Walrath. I serve as the Invasive Species Program Coordinator at the Upper Sugar River Watershed Association out of Mount Horeb. And this is our second time doing one of these trainings. We end up getting asked a lot about these questions. And so I've brought in the Renz Lab team, which is Leo Roth and Ann Pierce. Leo Roth is a research specialist, and Ann Pierce is the Wisconsin First Detector Network Program Coordinator. So they think about this stuff all the time, and their lab does a lot of this actual science behind what we're going to present today. What works, what doesn't work, what can they recommend as UW agents? So with no further ado, thanks again for attending, and we will get into our talk today. This is our agenda, and hopefully it'll come up here. There we go. So I'm going to, again, mention why we care about these things. We're going to get into how to ID 5 species and also the calendar of when you want to cut those things down. Some BMPs, best management practices, about how to decon and why we do these sort of things. Think about as you're doing project planning. A little bit about mechanical and chemical control of these species in particular. Wrap up, talk about mailings that we have that we can get out. We're making some cool resource guides that you can put up on your shop wall or inside your clerk office or whatever it is. And some resources as well. So with no further ado, I will launch into the definition of what we talk about when we mean invasive species. So just because something is aggressive, a plant that can take over quickly, does not make it necessarily an invasive species. So when we say non-indigenous, what we mean is stuff that is going to be coming in from outside of, in particular, Wisconsin. So these is really we have this rule called NR40 that I'll get into more later, but it covers both animals and plants. We're going to focus on plants because they tend to be the biggest nuisance of right-of-ways, not so much our animal or snail friends, but that's what we're looking at. That is a law. And here's some reasons why you might consider this to be important outside of management. We do highlight, however, that as these species grow up in the right-of-way or in a managed area, over time, they snowball and become more and more aggressive, and they can end up blocking out your sight lines, causing fire hazard, but they also do some other really nasty things that we can see. And that's why they're considered, invasive species are considered one of the top threats to biodiversity on the planet, up there with development and climate change. So they're definitely a big deal. And this prevention work and the controlling of pioneer stands is a really key way that you can save a lot of money down the road. And it's really good for the environment and our birds and our fish and everything else. One popular one that Ann will get into more, or maybe infamous, you might say, is you might know this guy along the side of the road. This is our wild parsnip. This is a great example. Invasive species, you do not want this spreading because it causes really nasty photosynthetic burns. I'm not going to pause on that very long because it's kind of nasty, but get that out of there before, and that's super widespread. So we're going to give you some techniques for how to control it if you have the resources, and just mainly don't spread it if you can avoid it. How do we define a native species versus a invasive species? Curtis wrote this book called The Vegetation of Wisconsin, and he kind of cataloged stuff that was around here when the settlers came in from Europe. That's kind of our benchmark to some extent. If it was here before then, it's considered native or indigenous. Afterwards, things become naturalized. There's also a prioritization tool, but hey, the invasive species, once they get listed, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. You cannot legally move this stuff around. And so you might recognize this slide from boat landing. When you start moving, as a contractor or a citizen, when you're moving around invasive species, seeds or fragments that could cause infestation, you are breaking a law in Wisconsin, which is, say, with Wisconsin NR 40. It is viable organisms, means that things that can actually have more offspring, that they can have, their seeds are still viable, or the roots can still spread. And then it also does talk about best management practices. Now, if you do what we're asking you to do, best management practices, you are doing the best you can in the eyes of the law. So by taking these steps and by cataloging them, you're keeping yourself and your crew safe from any kind of legal ramifications. Quickly, we do have two categories of invasive species in the state. We have restricted, which are usually quite widespread already, but we don't want them spreading further. That's like wild parsnip, for example. So they can't be introduced, but the DNR does not mandate control, versus a prohibited species, which you cannot legally possess. These are ones that are usually not very widespread yet in the state. We want to keep them that way by doing early detection, and like there's actually funding to control these things in particular if you know how to apply for it. So, you know, and it gets more complicated. Some things are restricted in some areas and prohibited in others. And that's, again, that's a prioritization tool for the DNR and for us practitioners to work from an area where if we make a dent, it makes a big difference versus trying to bail out all the phragmites that's on the east side of Wisconsin. There's a lot of phragmites, which you see here. And so that's why it's restricted over there. That's kind of my, so, you know, there's different control techniques that we can go through, and there is a manual that's quite dry that does exist, but it kind of breaks it into a bunch of different best management practices. And we generally think of things, what we're doing right now is called cultural control. We're learning about the species that we care about. We're preventing them from spreading. We're reporting them when we see them for the first time. There's also mechanical control, which is a big thing we think about for either digging or mowing. And then there's chemical control, which is using herbicides, pesticides to do our work for us.
45 seconds left, Matt.
Thank you. And so perfect. And with that sort of layout of why we're talking about this, why it's bad, I'm going to turn this back over to Anne, and she's going to introduce you to some of our worst perpetrators, the things out there that we want to really care about in the kind of Dane County and the driftless area in particular. So let me drop my share here, and I'll go to Anne's slides. Anne, unfortunately, has tech issues. Her working from home, her internet is not cooperating, and so we are going to go ahead and get her going here. Let's see if this will work. There we go.
So
Okay.
Anne, I saw you just rejoined the waiting room. Are you ready to go to advance your slides and tell Matt?
Are we still? Can you see the slides up? Is it still there?
Yes.
Okay.
And slides are up, and they look great.
Okay, and that will work. I can pop through that. So Anne, go ahead and take us away.
Yep, I'm going to unmute Anne's phone.
Oh, that's right. We have to make her a host again. So.
Yep.
Great.
I think that's going to be on you, Matt, because I cannot unmute it. And she's unmuted. Anne, you should be all clear.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sounds good. Thanks, Anne.
Perfect. Thanks for bearing with us, everybody, as I deal with terrible internet from home. So as Matt said in the introduction, I coordinate the Wisconsin First Detector Network, which is our statewide citizen monitoring program for primarily invasive plants. And so today I'm going to talk about how to identify the 5 kind of target roadside plants that we're talking about today. So that'll be wild parsnip, the teasels, purple loosestrife, Japanese knotweed and the other knotweeds, and then phragmites. And so, Matt, if you wanted to skip ahead to the wild parsnip slides, the other ones are about NR 40, but you already talked about that.
All right, here we go.
Cool, thanks, Matt. So, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, wild parsnip is one of our restricted species because it's very common statewide, and you can see the distribution map in the lower left corner of the slide. It's definitely covering pretty much all of our roadsides here in southern Wisconsin. So this is a plant that's a monocarpic perennial, which basically just means that it can exist kind of as a basal rosette or clump of leaves for several years, but then in the year that it flowers, it sets seeds and then that plant dies. When it is flowering, you'll see, as shown in the picture on the right, these flat-topped kind of circular clusters of tiny yellow flowers, and those flat-topped flower clusters are called umbels. And the flowering stalks of these plants tend to grow up to 5 feet or maybe even a little bit taller. These are really shade intolerant plants, so you're not going to see these on your roadsides if you have like a lot of shade cover from forest nearby. But in your sunny, wide open rights of ways, you will likely see wild parsnip everywhere. It can grow in wetter or drier conditions. Pretty much as long as it has sun, it can grow. And this one starts blooming typically in June here in Wisconsin and will be in bloom into July or potentially a little bit later. Next slide. So the upper picture on the right is that basil rosette that I was referring to. So that gives you a good idea of, you know, as soon as the snow melts and these plants start emerging in the spring, this is what they're going to look like. The leaves in the basil rosette are pretty much the same as the leaves that you'll see on the stem. So each leaf has 5 to 7 pairs of leaflets. So big compound leaf there. And then as the stems grow up, as you can see in the picture on the lower right, they're grooved. And then if you were to cut them open, they would be hollow. And Matt already talked about the burns that you can get from wild parsnip. So the picture on the lower left is what we're trying to avoid. We would like to not see these wide, huge swaths of wild parsnip, not only because of the damage to other vegetation, but because of that health concern. Next slide. There are a couple wild parsnip lookalikes I want to share. The first is cow parsnip on the left. I think people get cow parsnip confused with wild parsnip mostly because of the name. They are related, but as you can see, cow parsnip has white flowers instead of yellow flowers, and it's got really big, broad leaves. On the right, though, is golden Alexander's, which is a native species that is much more easy to confuse with wild parsnips because it also has yellow flowers. The key to telling these apart is that golden Alexander's typically blooms earlier in the year. It's usually just finishing up blooming by the time wild parsnip starts blooming in June. And then in the very middle of the picture of golden Alexander's, it's probably a little bit hard to see, but if you can make out the leaf there, you'll see that golden Alexander's has a 3-parted leaf. And remember that wild parsnip has, you know, like 10 to 15 leaflets on each leaf instead of 3. Next slide. Okay, so next we're going to move into our teasels, and we have 2 species of invasive teasel in Wisconsin. This is another monocarpic perennial, so it can hang out in that basil rosette kind of clump of leaf stage for several years. When it flowers, though, you're going to be looking for these egg-shaped spiky flower heads, like you can see on the picture on the right. And there really aren't other species in Wisconsin that have that distinctly spiky flower head like that. If you're getting a closer look at the plant, you can see a prickly stem, and there's a good picture of that in the kind of bottom center of the slide. And in that picture, you might also be able to see how the leaves join around the stem and they kind of form a cup. There's also bracts at the base of the flower head that are kind of spiky as well. Next slide. And I just wanted to point out, again, there are these 2 species, common teasel and cutleaf teasel. It really makes no difference whether you figure out exactly what species you have. If you have teasel, you're going to manage them exactly the same. But if you want to nerd out on some plants for a minute, the common teasel typically has kind of purplish flowers, and then the bracts that are coming from the base of that egg spiky thing are usually taller than the flower head. Versus our cutleaf teasel over on the right typically have more whitish flowers, and those bracts below the flower head are much shorter. And the cutleaf teasel leaves also look like they have the edges of the leaves cut out. So big, deep lobes on the leaves. Next slide. All right, moving on to purple loosestrife, and we're kind of progressing through the summer here. The teasels, you'll start seeing those flower heads usually in June, and then they'll be blooming kind of throughout the summer, but then those flower heads stay standing throughout the winter. Purple loosestrife starts blooming a bit later in the summer. So this is one of our wetland invasive plants, which also means that it really loves our wet roadside ditches. It's an herbaceous plant, meaning it's not actually a woody plant like a shrub or a tree, but as it gets older, it can tend to feel pretty woody. So if you're looking at it up close, you can feel it has 4 to 6-sided ridged stems. But at a glance, it can grow pretty tall, 3 to 7 feet. You're looking for this one again in those really sunny areas, but also partially shady areas. And next slide. And that closer up look, really what you're going to notice about this plant starting in July when it's blooming is these bright kind of magenta colored spikes of flowers, as you can see on the right. And these ones are kind of interesting. They start blooming from the base of that spike and kind of move up the spike. But later in the summer, if you see that flash of purple in the ditch, it's most likely purple loosestrife. Next slide. All right, up next we've got our knotweed. So we actually have 3 species of invasive knotweed here in Wisconsin. These are very bamboo-like plants. They've got kind of tall, arching stems. And then if you look at the picture on the right, kind of the upper right corner of that picture, you can see the stem, and there's kind of a red swollen area where there's a node on the stem. And that's kind of one of the characteristics that makes this look like bamboo, although it's not actually related to any bamboo plants. But you're going to look for tall, arching stems, 10+ feet tall, alternate leaves. This one, though, it becomes really noticeable later in the summer, so August into September when it's flowering, because it has these big plumes of tiny white flowers that kind of pop up from the top of the stem, as you can see in the picture on the bottom. Next slide. And our 3 species that we have are Japanese knotweed, which is the smallest of the 3, giant knotweed, which is the largest of the 3, and then they hybridize to form Bohemian knotweed. So that's kind of an in-between size and has in-between characteristics. And again, it doesn't matter a lot whether you can figure out exactly what species you have. And in fact, it's very hard to do that because of the hybridization. The management, again, is still the same for all of these species. Next slide. All right, moving on to phragmites. So if you look at the map in the upper right-hand corner, you can see this is an example of what we call a split-listed species. So in the eastern half of the state, where phragmites is pretty common, as you can also see on the distribution map in the bottom right corner, this species is restricted. But in the western half of the state, it is prohibited. So depending on what county you're in, phragmites might be restricted or it might be prohibited for you. And so that's going to play into potentially your ability to get funding for it, or whether DNR is going to mandate control of phragmites on properties that you're responsible for. There is a native phragmites and an invasive phragmites. So phragmites, the one we're talking about right now is the invasive, but we'll do a quick comparison. But the invasive phragmites grows up to 15 feet tall. It's a perennial grass. The picture kind of in the upper center shows kind of runners going between stems of the phragmites. And that's a huge way that this spreads and forms really, really dense stands spread by those runners. Those runners can go under a lot of materials like bike paths for sure. But you're going to look in wet areas for these really dense stands of the grasses. They have really feathery flower heads that become pretty obvious later in the summer and into the fall. And often you'll see those plumes of grass flower heads kind of sticking around through the winter. With our invasive phragmites, the leaves actually stay on the stems through the winter as well, versus the native phragmites where they don't. Next slide. So this is just a quick comparison, and some of this is really like looking really close up at the plant to figure out if it's native or non-native. We don't expect people to remember this, but the picture is kind of a nice comparison. So on the left side of the picture is the native phragmites, and the right side is the non-native. So you can really see the difference in terms of how dense that flower head is. On the non-native or the invasive phragmites on the right side, it's much more dense and full. And that's true of like the stands of grasses themselves too. The invasive phragmites, it's going to be a really dense stand. can hardly walk through it. Native phragmites still looks pretty dense, but in comparison, it's not so thick you could actually move through it. Next slide. And then here's just a couple more close-up pictures. In this case, the species are kind of flipped. So in this case, the non-native or invasive phragmites is on the left side of these picture groups, and the native phragmites is on the right. So if you take a look at the stems, on the far right side of our native phragmites, often has kind of a reddish tint to it. So if you see that reddish, it's a really good indication it's the native phragmites. The left side of that is a non-native phragmites, kind of a dull green to tannish stem. And it's very ridged. Like if you ran your fingernail over it, you could feel the ridges on the stem. Next slide. So that was just a really quick overview of our 5 species. I wanted to highlight a couple of other quick tools too that we have out of the First Detector Network and the Renz Lab. The first is our WisTip Viewer, which is an interactive map. So if you just want to see what species have been mapped in your county or your town or near where you live, this is a nice tool to use. Next slide. And you can access this on the First Detector Network website, and I know we'll be sending out these resources, so we'll make sure that people get links. But if you go ahead and click again, Matt, if you click on the tools section, that's where you can access this map and a quick guide on how to use it. Next slide. And then the other tool I wanted to highlight is our invasive species calendar. So another interactive tool. Next slide. And then you can click again, Matt. But basically for this tool, each row is a species and each column is a different month. And so the color of the circle is the life stage, as you can see on the legend on the right. So it's basically giving you an indication of, if you're looking for a particular species in a month, what stage of the plant should you look for? And then how filled in the circle is an indication of how detectable that species is in that month. And so if it's totally filled in, that means that that's going to be the best month to look for that species. Next slide. And click again. And then these drop-down menus let you kind of customize a view of your calendar. So under Habitat, if you're only interested in roadside plants, you could select that. And it would eliminate plants that you wouldn't have to worry about on roadsides. You could use the months if you only want to know what to look for in April and May coming up in the next few months. You could customize the calendar that way as well. Next slide. So again, this is available in the same place on the First Detector Network website under that Tools tab. And again, there's a quick guide on that page if you want to kind of learn the ins and outs of the features of the calendar. Next. I guess next again. So yeah, that's all I've got, and I will do my best to stay connected to technology and try to be able to answer questions as we move on. So thanks, Matt, for controlling my slides.
You're welcome, man. Great job. And yep, she's an expert on this sort of stuff. And if you ever submit stuff to EdMaps, she's the one that might be verifying it. So didn't get into that, but that's where a lot of the stuff's coming from, is the EdMaps database, which is a cool thing. So with that, let's get, I'm going to get back to my slides and talk. So now we know a bit about what we're looking at. And there's lots more species out there, but we don't want to overwhelm you. There's lots of resources if you want to dig into what's in your region. Those are great tools, though, for finding out in particular. Okay, so back to my presentation here. So I was talking about a little bit about best management practices. So there's a link down here. It's also going to be at the end of the site. It's a really nice, like detailed, laid out by best management practices with actions. It's quite dry though, so I'm not going to put it up here on the screen. However, especially for managers and shop owners, worth looking at this because it's going to give you the breakdown of all the things you would think about. However, I'm going to go through some best management practices kind of distilled from what I think is important. First of all, work from a clean area to an infested area, which is to say, you saw those maps earlier. If you know you have an invasive species like knotweed at one part of your site, but it's not on the other part of your site, do your best to work from where it's clean to where it is infested. That way you're not, if you're not moving around soil or seed or anything, that's an overall site plan too. So if you have a bunch of multiple sites that you can, if you can choose the order, again, work from those clean sites to avoid spreading invasive species to the more pristine ones. Okay, so what else? Again, this is all in the law, and this is important. This is stuff that contractors need to know. Check and clean your gear before you leave, before you go to a new site. So you see a farmer here looking at his tools. You know, give it a gander. It's up to you. I'm not your mom. I'm not going to clean your machines for you. So, and please remind your teams to do this sort of stuff. So we don't want these things moving around. A lot of these things, like, so phragmites was illustrated, I think knotweed as well. They mostly spread by fragments under the ground. They're getting a bit of root clump picked up in a machine or in a mow deck or in a bucket and moved. So there's a lot of ways to clean tools, and there's lots of spots to check, but a clean tool is a happy tool. It's better for the machine. It's the law, and it's going to help you down the road for any kind of legal or infestation issues. There's lots of ways. So I'm talking about dump trucks here. I'm talking about the treads of your machines. I'm talking about your boots. I'm talking about your cab. Get the vacuum out. You know, I know it's a muddy job. It's a lot of work, and so again, that's why it's just do the best you can. But it is important to take these steps. You see these things on the sides of the road, so consider getting yourself a portable wash pad. Nothing quite like a high pressure wash machine in a shed. You do want to control this stuff enough. Ideally, you can do this at the site. You know, if you have a large facility, you know, scrape your mud off a little bit before you move to the next site. Or if you have to do it back at your shop, because that's where you have the machines, that's fine. But we want this stuff off in a contained area before we go to a new site to prevent that infestation. And, you know, it's kind of a funny thing, but it really is ounce prevention sort of stuff. So by doing this and making this part of your protocols and part of what you do every day, you know, you can take a little bit of brushing the bottom of your mow deck off versus a huge infestation of really difficult to control invasive species. This is phragmites again on the bottom left. So that work goes a long way. Going back to the fill issue a little bit, know your fill. Those are those resources that we can get you that we're talking about. You know, if you have the wherewithal to look at the map and see where it's been reported, or if you know what the species looks like. This is knotweed here pictured. This stuff goes all the way down. They can go 30 feet in any direction from the main clump. So this whole thing is going to be infested with knotweed, and a segment about this big of root can make a whole new infestation. So this stuff's considered toxic waste, like living toxic waste or hazardous waste in the UK. Knotweed, it's really a big deal. So, and it mostly clones itself, like I said. So prevent that kind of stuff. So again, there's some clean equipment protocols here, and I will just highlight a little bit. So this is also linked in the resource page. It's a nice, it's a better written one than our DNR one. Just got better pictures. And the DNR one though, this is kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about the actual BMPs, and you know, this is the dry stuff I'm not going to get into right now, but they're all laid out, planning activities, things like that in that DNR resource. And if you were to look at where you wanted to do some stuff, there is the Lakes and AIS viewer as well as EdMaps, two different tools that we can keep on track of to see where we have reported spreads. Now, it's not a definitive tool. This stuff tends to be quite underreported. So just because it doesn't say there's not something at the site, you know, take that for it's useful, but it doesn't mean you're in the clear entirely. Use your own eyes and your own knowledge to the best of your ability. But there are resources that we can walk you through for how to do this stuff with the DNR program. And part of what I do is put this stuff into the database so you can see it later. One other thing about soil disturbance in particular that you might know is that invasives love that open dirt. So if you can get a variety of things to ground cover that are native, ideally, so there's not that open. I mean, this is usually best management anyways, but it's just a reminder that these seeds, especially like teasel and wild parsnip, they love that newly disturbed soil. So work to mitigate that. Throw your seed mixes too. So these are things that are we don't want to use, even though they used to be recommended. So, and they're out there. Some of them are restricted. You know, work with your ecologists or with your contractors if you're going to do revegetation to use stuff that's good for the environment or native to the ability. Not use these things that are bad. So skip through these here. Yeah, I'm actually with that, I'm going to go ahead and drop my slides again. And so now you know a bit about some of the best management practices that we're talking about. There's a lot more resources. We can't be quite as comprehensive, but again, it's up to you to clean your tools. So bring a brush out in the field. If you go through a big deck of a big stand of what you know to be non-native phragmites, consider getting out there and brushing off your mow deck, because we're not going to be effective killing this stuff by mowing it. It's part you have to do a whole integrated pest management plan, but you can quite easily spread this stuff. And I see it all the time, just going down the highway. You can see where one mow deck, the next spot, that's how they're spreading. Or maybe even by pylons. Like I can see Japanese knotweed coming out of an area under a new utility pole, and that's the only spot. So how did it get there? Probably in the fill for that utility. So those are some brief BMPs and decon ideas. And with that, so if that doesn't work, so that's the idea. So get ahead of yourself. Now let's talk a bit more about control. So here comes Leo. Thank you, Leo. And I'll stop sharing. You'll be able to pop that puppy up.
All right. Thank you, Matt. And then you're going to tell me if everything looks good on my end. Can you see the presentation mode?
I can see it. It looks great.
Rad. All right. Well, thanks for coming out, everybody, today. Again, my name is Leo Roth. I'm a research specialist in Dr. Mark Renz's weed science lab at the UW-Madison. I'm a colleague of Ann's, and as Matt so helpfully indicated, I'm going to talk about some management strategies for some of these invasive plants we've been focusing on today in roadside rights-of-way. So what to do when decontamination may have let you down and you need to manage these plants. So quick outline, I'm going to review how we at the Renz lab apply herbicides. I think that'll be a refresher for many of you, but some good key points to review for myself and others, I'm sure. I will quickly talk about how my lab pulls together the data to make the chart of herbicide effectiveness that doubtless many of you are excited to see. I know I am. And then we'll talk about some species by species management strategies and efficacy data for the 5 main species that Anne highlighted ID for. So quick overview here, in the Renz lab, we like to make a distinction between 2 main methods for applying herbicides in rights-of-way. On the left, we see a pretty typical broadcast application of herbicide, and this can be done with a boomless or boom sprayer. There's a boomless sprayer in this photo, and those are typically applied on a per unit area basis, so ounces per acre. And so you'll determine what your spray volume is going to be based on how many lane miles of right-of-way that you're going to be treating with your herbicide mixture. Whereas on the right, we have the trusty old backpack sprayer, which is typically used for what's called a spot or individual plant treatment, where you're walking around on foot or with a handgun out of a ATV, for example, and spraying each individual plant. So instead of broadcast spraying the entire right-of-way, you are actually walking up to each plant and spraying it to the point of herbicide runoff. And those solutions are measured in what's called percent volume by volume or weight by volume measurements. So in other words, you put in a set percentage or ratio of herbicide relative to your final spray solution. So for example, a 1% volume by volume solution would be 1 ounce of herbicide in 100 ounces of finished solution of herbicide mixture that you're making. So key distinction, broadcast versus individual plant treatment. And this is a screenshot from some of the fact sheets on invasive plant management on the Renz Weed Science website. And so this is for teasels in particular. And I'll just highlight that there is a call out for the broadcast and spot treatment rates for managing teasels. So you'll see these rates time and time again in fact sheets like this. So it's really key to have a good idea of what the distinction is between those. And we might have some time in the Q&A if there are any specific questions. And I'll also call out that there's often these cautionary statements in fact sheets about particular limitations for any of these management methods, particularly herbicides that I'll be talking about today. And it's really important to pay attention to these. A lot of times, for example, you can't apply these herbicides wherever there is standing water, i.e. a wetland, or even a wet ditch, because that violates the herbicide label, which is violating federal and state law. So good to try and not do that, but also good for the environment too. So always pay attention to those label restrictions that are on fact sheets and herbicide labels. But the key detail here is it's pretty easy to get confused. There can be a ton of data on these labels and these fact sheets. So as Matt has highlighted, don't be afraid to reach out to my lab, to Matt. We do this all day, every day. So we're happy to answer the questions that inevitably come up, because this stuff can get pretty confusing. And I'll also highlight just some quick data from an experiment that the Renz lab did in 2019 for managing some invasive species in rights of way. And we were comparing the cost of some of these different methods that I'll be talking about today. You see some pretty stark differences. The leftmost bar is the cost per lane mile to broadcast spray escort to control wild parsnip. It's a super effective treatment, and the point here is that it's pretty affordable relative to some of these other options. So next to that, we have individual plant treatment of wild parsnip. I think I applied 2,4-D plus dicamba, and that's where I was literally walking through the media and spraying one plant at a time. And I'll note that $40 per lane mile is an average from 5 different sites that I visited. And so some of the sites were really cheap, some were much more expensive than 40 bucks a lane mile. And it just comes down to how dense these infestations are. If you have hundreds of plants or thousands per lane mile, if you have to stop and spray each one, that labor cost can really add up quickly. So something to keep in mind, but either way, it tends to be more affordable than mowing to control invasive plants. Mowing, as many of you know, can be pretty expensive per lane mile, and even with a low estimate of $70 per lane mile, these other options can come in as more affordable. So just some quick estimates there for you to consider as you're thinking about what's the best fit for your organization and the approach you would like to take. And I'll just quickly mention, when we create these efficacy tables that you'll be seeing shortly, really all we do is we apply these various treatments, be they mechanical mowing, be they chemical, and then we return to the sites and monitor the vegetation by taking photos, collecting data for the next year to 2 years to determine how effective these treatments are in both the short term and the long term. And we also will pull together other people's data from other similar experiments to create resources like this one. So here's kind of a master herbicide efficacy table for our 5 species of interest today: knotweeds, frag, purple loosestrife, teasels, and wild parsnip. And so I know there's a ton of data on this table. Don't scramble to copy this all down. It'll be up on Matt's website when we're done here, but suffice it to say that there are tons of different herbicide options out there if you're considering a chemical control option. And what I'd like to highlight is that there are a lot of differences in that these control options are really species specific. The effectiveness of each of these products is very species specific. So what works for one species may not work for another. And that just comes down to the plant physiology and the way that the herbicides work on the plant. So really pay attention to these kinds of tables when you start to think about the tools that are the best fit for the plants that you need to manage. And the other thing that I'll call out is the price column in the bottom of this table. A lot of variability in how much these products cost. Some cost about $5 an acre to apply. Some cost about $50 or more an acre to apply. So that's just another data point that you'll want to think about incorporating as you're considering your options here. And it's the same kind of story for mechanical control, where the efficacy or the effectiveness of these methods really depends on the species and what time of year you're mowing them at. It's super important to keep those details in mind. So we can see that teasels and wild parsnip only require a couple of mowing, or sorry, one mowing per year if you really nail that timing. And we'll talk about what that timing is, but the key point here is that purple loosestrife requires multiple mowings per year to prevent flowering and reproduction. And knotweeds require even more mowings per year, and the root and stem fragments can reroot if you spread them around and don't dispose of them properly. So that can be a bit of a hazard. And then for frag, mowing is pretty much totally ineffective. So again, the efficacy of mowing to control these species It's very species specific, and it depends on the timing of mechanical control. So just another thing to keep in mind as you're considering your options and what plants you have growing on your rights of way. So I think now we can zoom into some species specific management. And so we'll start with wild parsnip, and the thought here is we're going to go from easiest to control to most challenging to control. So to believe it or not, wild parsnip is actually one of the easier plants to control from this list. And I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but we'll go through it step by step. The main takeaway is that, again, the timing of mechanical management for mowing specifically is essential. Just as a reminder, as Anne highlighted, because these plants are monocarpic perennials, once they flower, they die, which is awesome because that means if we can prevent viable seed production for multiple consecutive years, we will deplete the accumulated seeds that have built up in the soil seed bank and eventually eradicate the population. And so to do that, we have to conduct our mechanical management when the secondary umbels, those circular yellow flower clusters, so there's a primary umbel, the big yellow flower on the top of the flowering stalk, when those smaller secondary umbels are forming in late June to mid-July in southern Wisconsin, that's when we need to get those mowings completed, because that will prevent the plant from producing viable seed in that growing season. And that way we also won't spread viable seed by mowing too late. And so in that mowing chart in the upper right, you can see that from mid-July and onward, if we mow, those flowers will have viable seed present and will actually be making the infestation worse rather than better. So really important to get that timing right. And as a final point, in the image on the right side of this slide, you can see some wild parsnip in a right-of-way. All of those little yellow flowers at ground level are wild parsnip flower stalks that have re-sprouted after being mowed, maybe in late May or early June. In other words, too early or prior to the optimal mowing timing. And so those wild parsnip flowers are going to still produce viable seed in this photo, and the infestation will continue to persist or to spread. And so again, timing is critical. And so here are some images from some work we've done, where on the left, I mowed this site twice at the incorrect timing, and on the right, I mowed it once at the correct timing. This is 1 year after I did the mowing. And you would be right to wonder, well, what the heck, Leo? There's tons of wild parsnip. Each of those little plants, all those rosettes are wild parsnips. And you'd be right to say there's a ton in each photo. So what's the deal here? And just to reiterate, it requires multiple consecutive years, 3 to 5 years of mowing at the optimal timing to deplete that seed bank. Because remember, there's just years of these seeds that have built up at these sites. And so you need to prevent seed production for consecutive years successfully, and to prevent the reintroduction of new seeds from your mower decks, from elsewhere, from outside of our rights of ways, to eliminate an infestation. So it can be easier said than done. I'll also highlight, here's just a quick chemical management option. As you may recall from the previous table, there were tons of chemical options for wild parsnip and for teasel. So the image at the right is broadcast applying Escort at 1/2 ounce per acre. This is 1 year after we sprayed, and there's no wild parsnip. And there are a lot of other options that will yield similar results. This plant's fairly easy to control with herbicides, and you can compare that to the untreated control in the leftmost image. And so moving on to teasels, again, another monocarpic perennial that dies after it flowers. And so it's a pretty similar story to wild parsnip. For mowing, here's a little calendar. You can mow teasel a bit later in the growing season into the end of July, but again, you do not want to mow it after that time, or you will be spreading viable seed and making the infestation worse. The image at the left is an untreated control plot. Tons of teasel seed heads. It's very happy, lots of viable seed getting produced. Image at the right, and bear in mind, this is in the fall of the mowing year. So this is about 3 years after mowing at the optimal timing, 3 months after. And we can see, although there are some, if you look closely, little teasel seed heads popping up near the soil surface, We actually did a seed viability test in the lab on these flowers, and we found that no viable seeds were produced by these flower heads because they didn't have enough time in the growing season to re-sprout and to have the seeds ripen. And so we prevented viable seed production, and if we continued nailing this timing, this population would eventually die back. And so again, here's a chemical management option for teasel. We used open site at 2 ounces an acre in the image at the right. This is 1 year after spraying. Again, no teasel. It's a very stark difference compared to the image at the left. But just like with wild parsnip, there are quite a few options. This can be an easier one to control, put simply. But remember, we're going from easy to hard. So this is purple loosestrife, kind of intermediate level of challenge, I would argue. Unfortunately, I don't have any great photos from personal experiments that I've done. But again, I can say that mowing this plant can be a bit more challenging because it requires multiple mowings per year to prevent seed production. And you have to do it whenever the plant seems like it's about to flower, late spring and thereafter, and the control provided by mechanical management is rather low. And so people tend to go towards chemical management. And because this plant often grows in wet ditches or wetlands, wherever there's standing water present, you often need to consider if it is growing in those wet areas, you must use an herbicide that is labeled for aquatic use. And so that really limits our tool set to 2 main active ingredients in particular, typically imazapyr, which is arsenal or habitat, or glyphosate, which is rodeo or aquaneat for aquatic labeling. And so just from this chart, we can see that arsenal/habitat, which are both imazapyr products labeled for wetland use, have very good control, very good efficacy on purple loosestrife. So that can be a good solution. But imazapyr is a broad spectrum herbicide. It kills everything it touches. It has a long persistence in the soil, so it can prevent new plants from growing and leave bare ground. So a lot of considerations with imazapyr in particular, and it's also fairly expensive. So these are all things you need to bake into your decision matrix, or whatever you want to call it, when you're thinking about what approach is best for you. So moving on to phragmites, we're getting more and more challenging here. Here are a couple nice photos from an experiment I did in Fitchburg in 2019. Image at the right is spot or individual plant treating some phragmites with glyphosate or Roundup Power Max at 2% volume by volume, or 2 ounces of Roundup per 100 ounces of final spray solution. And this is a few months after I sprayed in the fall. So we can see brown, necrotic, dead vegetation compared to the green and happy vegetation in the untreated control plot at the left. And so when we look at the table of our options, again, mechanical management is pretty much useless, and phragmites does not control this plant at most. People will typically mow phragmites in the winter when the ground is frozen with a skid steer or a pull-behind mower to promote new growth in the spring, so they can then apply herbicides in the spring for increased efficacy. There's a whole lot of intel information out there from other agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service and others, on best management practices for frag. It can be really challenging. Suffice it to say that both arsenal/habitat or imazapyr, or rodeo/aquaneat or glyphosate are good fits in aquatic environments, which is often where you find phragmites. It loves wetlands and wet ditches. And so there are some options for this plant that are chemical. And so I'll wrap it up with knotweeds, which is a known tricky plant to control. You can try and mow knotweed, and at risk of repeating what you've heard a couple of times, can be done to manage this plant. You need repeated mowings in a single growing season, so the costs can really add up. In addition, the stem fragments can re-root, so if you're not really careful at bagging up and landfilling or burning those root fragments after you mow them, you're likely making the infestation worse rather than better. So really not a great option. We tend to recommend chemical management, and the real winner here is typically Milestone or aminopyrrolate. It's one of the few products that really seems to work well on this species, which is just notoriously difficult to control, as I know Matt can attest to. So those are my thoughts for knotweeds. I know we covered a lot of ground, so feel free to type those questions into the text box or email me at nlroth2@wisc. There's our lab's website, Renz Weed Science. There's a lot of good resources on there. There's an invasive plant identification guide. There are some management fact sheets that I just briefly touched on, and some herbicide and management experiment updates from 2020 as well. There's a lot of good resources there. Check it out if you have time. With that, I would say thank you and turn it back to Matt to wrap it up. And I'm going to stop sharing, Matt.
Great work, Leo. It's really good stuff. Nice to see the science and some, yeah, people keep on asking. The PDF will be available, so you can unpack this, print it, share it with your friend, family.
It's a lot of data.
Yeah, but we're trying to get a lot of packed in here. Hopefully it's kind of a jumping off point for some of these fights, so again, we can be your guides as well. So thanks for that. And with that, I'm just going to wrap up. We got 5 minutes left on our hour, and then Leo's got to take off, but Ann and I can stick around for about 15 minutes to answer questions. So we can so look forward to that. But that being said, let me back to my screen share, and I will finish off with the resource slide here, just to highlight again what you see. That Leo, you up? Anybody?
Yeah, it's active.
Thank you, sir. Now again, a lot of this mirrors what you'll see at boat landings, like I mentioned earlier. Inspect, remove, drain, never move. Same ideas for when we're talking about your machines or your boots or whatever it is. Here's some resources that are already highlighted. I'm going to combine all these things into one big PDF, but there's the Renz Weed Science. They've got a lot. They've got that calendar. They've got fact sheets. They've got trials, all kinds of cool stuff on there. The those really dry lists of species of BMPs that I've flipped through quite quickly. That's the forestry guide to right-of-way prevention. There's also recommendations for mowing times. It does mention the mowing bird period in there as well. It's a thing we didn't talk about, but there's some talk about making sure you don't mow during native bird nesting season. But Ann raises a great point, which is that if we don't mow, so we're disrupting habitat, but if we let the invasives take over, then there's no habitat. So it's, you have to make your decisions. There is a great Ontario guide that I mentioned that has good pictures and a bunch of plant ID stuff too. And then if you're looking for the actual disinfection code for aquatic stuff in particular, there's a link to the WDNR, the law that has a bunch of techniques and recommendations for chemicals that you can use, techniques and things like that are, I bet, out of the scope of today's talk, but are very important for especially practitioners. And hey, lakes are right away, rivers are right away too, right? Sometimes, so it's important to know aquatically what we're talking about. We did a big blast to get this out, but we know it's one of those under represented areas. So here's these gents again. Please do share this knowledge that you're gaining today and these links with the contractors that do the mowing in your town. Maybe it's the city team, maybe it's a mom and pop landscape company or whatever it is. They're the ones that are going to be doing this, and that can make a big difference in this fight. So it's not just us eggheads sitting in our offices. We really want to get this out to the people with the Modex underneath them all the time. So please do share this far and wide. To that effect, this exact team, with the help of Dane County, is in the process of making a visual resource that we can get out to you that has a lot of these recommendations all, and it's going to be a trifold with this kind of central pinup. So talking about how effective stuff is. And I do want to zoom in just for a minute on knotweed. Now, we're saying it's effective to cut it down, but this is like, I've been doing this in my own backyard, and it's still, you won't really kill it. You can kind of control it, but it's really not that effective to mow it. So if you have to for right-of-way reasons, but don't think you're going to have effective control without some pesticides in any kind of scale. I mean, very small patches, maybe with a lot of attention, but when we're talking acres of infestation or lots of right-of-way lines, not really viable. So this will be a resource that I will be sending out to people that request it when it's finished, and we'll have kind of a sign up for this with a full set of kind of details for how it's used, and another video that goes along with this to explain more, probably a formal video, like 5 minutes, to explain the process. And I just want to thank everyone for coming. And as Leo mentioned, as Ann mentioned, as I mentioned, don't be shy. We are a resource. This is why we do this. Partially, this is our own PR to get our name out there that we are the people that are thinking about this and moving this forward in your region. So I cover the Southwest driftless area of the state. The Renz Lab is statewide, so this is really focused on kind of southern Wisconsin in our threats, but we do know a lot more about other things that are on the rise as well. So with that, I'd like to once again thank our presenters, Leo and Ann, for all their hard work and good thoughts. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we're going to have a moment for, if you, I'll allow you to unmute yourself and to show your videos. If there's any questions, we can go for about another 15 minutes. So thanks again for coming, and don't be a stranger. Okay.